Hello, it's Sarah with GSMC Book Review Podcast, here to talk to you once again about Linens and Hutch and the fabulous sale they have going on. If you haven't heard of Linens and Hutch, you should check them out. They provide everything you need for your bed, from mattress toppers to sheets to quilts and reversible down alternative comforters, bamboo sheets, which are fabulous. Anything you could need for your bed in classic colors that are not going to go out of style. They have some great products. You should check them out, and you should really check them out right now, because if you go to linensandhutch.com, use the promo code GSMCBOOK during checkout, you will receive 70% off everything on their website, plus free shipping. You really can't beat that. You may wonder how they can accomplish this. They do so by cutting out the middle person, working directly with manufacturers and designers. Like I said, they have classic colors. They give you a 100-night trial. So if you are not satisfied with the products that you order, you can send those back within that 100-night trial time frame, and they will give you your money back. Really, what can you lose? Go to linensandhutch.com, use the promo code GSMCBOOK at checkout, and you will receive 70% off, plus free shipping, plus that 100 nights free trial. Check it out.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you, as always. I'm always happy to be with you. I swear it's true. I'm not just saying that. I love chatting with all y'all about books. And as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, we do have another returning author joining me on the podcast today. Jim Nelson is the author, and he joined me for our first chat way back in March of 2018, so that is 2.5 years ago. First off, I am often astounded that I've been doing the podcast this long. I mean, I've been doing it longer than that. I think it's been around 4 years now, but it doesn't feel like that long. It's gone so fast, and wow, 2.5 years ago. And that was all the way back episode 65. So I've done almost 200 other episodes since Jim was last on the podcast. I mostly just bring that up because I am gobsmacked at the moment. And to use the word gobsmacked, flabbergasted. Insert your other favorite words here. At any rate, Jim has returned, and he has 2 new books, which is exciting. One is called Stranger Sun, and that is from the series, his Bridge Daughter series that we talked about the last time he joined us. And what we're going to be talking about first is his new cyber-noir thriller called In My Memory, Locked. Here is the description of that book. In 2038, the internet has been retired and digitally archived on Alcatraz Island. In its place stands the Nexternet, a worldwide network capable of transmitting all sensory experiences: sights, sounds, love, hate, fears, even memories. When a security breach is detected on Alcatraz, security consultant C.F. Neroy is hired to investigate and recover the stolen internet history. As he's drawn into the expanding mystery, he uncovers blackmail, political intrigue, and more than a few dead bodies. He also learns the stolen data is so explosive, people are willing to kill for it. Then, Neroy discovers his haunted past is the key to the entire affair. He must choose between solving the crime or burying it for good. You can tell just by that description that there's a lot going on in this book, right? So, the setting, first of all, 2038. Not that far, 18 years. Whew, that's not that far away. We are in the Bay Area, obviously, since the old internet is now being archived on Alcatraz, which I find interesting on so many levels. I don't know if you've ever been to Alcatraz, but it's a pretty fascinating place. And, now it's housing, if that's the right word, the old internet. So you've got this not so far in the future setting in the Bay Area, although maybe not a Bay Area that you would recognize. It's a little different than what it is now. You've got this new technology, this Nexternet, which Jim will tell you more about when we start the interview. But I'm good. I'm good with the regular internet right now. I don't want the Nexternet. I have decided that in this case, I am old, I am a Luddite, and I don't want the Nexternet. You can make your own decision when Jim tells us about it in the interview. You've got, dead bodies. You've got the main character's past coming back to haunt him. All of those great layers that make up a suspenseful thriller, a mystery, trying to sort through all those layers and those details. And it doesn't really help that the Nexternet can kind of recreate your memories for you. And so are you actually remembering what you're remembering, or are you remembering how it is presented to you on the Nexternet? So confusing. Rather than me trying to explain this all to you, I'm going to let Jim do so. So let's turn now to the interview with Jim Nelson. And again, the book is called In My Memory Locked. Hi, Jim. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
I am happy to have you back, and we are here to talk. You actually have two new books out right now. The first one we're going to talk about is our thriller. It's called In My Memory Locked. Before we get to that book, though, for people who might not have heard the first interview or need a refresher, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Jim Nelson. I've been writing for quite a while now. But in the last 6 years or so, I've really kind of picked up the pace and started producing some novels, mostly science fiction, speculative fiction, although not exclusively. I live in San Francisco, and most of my work takes place in and around the Bay Area or Northern California. Yeah, and I just enjoy writing, and I enjoy sharing my writing with other people, and I'm a software engineer by trade, so that's my day job. This is sort of my second job.
And your bio mentions that you divide your time between San Francisco and Tokyo. Are you traveling much now with the world being as it is?
No, that's unfortunately I sort of wrote that bio probably just a couple months before everything went upside down. No, I have not had a chance to get to Tokyo again this year. We were there in January and February. And we came back right before the lockdown started. Hopefully get a chance to go back, but it's really kind of touch and go at this point.
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, this is a cyber-noir thriller, which I think actually is very... I think it tells you a lot. I mean, you've got the noir part, you've got the thriller part, but it's also, cyber. So, it's going to have something to do technology-wise. So can you give an overview of In My Memory Locked?
Sure. It's I sort of explain it. It's both a private eye detective mystery as well as a science fiction cyberpunk story. It involves a character named Noroi, he's not technically a private eye, he's a security consultant, but for his role in the book, he's essentially a private eye. He is called to, this takes place in near future San Francisco, where the internet has been replaced by a new worldwide network called the Nexternet. And the Nexternet is completely different than the internet in the sense that it's connected directly to your brain. You people walk around the world, and they're connected to each other. They're sending messages to each other. They're sending their own experiences and memories and so forth across the network. And the detective, Noroi, is called to go to Alcatraz Island, where the last remnants of the old internet are kept in storage as sort of like a reference or a library that people can go to in the future to see what was going on the internet in our time today. And what's happened is a piece of that, the old internet, has been stolen, and he's hired to discover who stole it and to get it back. and he discovers pretty early on that the piece that's been stolen is actually connected to his own past, which is very spotty. So he has a stake in this, is in other words.
Yeah, absolutely. It's set in the near future, 2038, so not that far away from where we are.
Right.
What made you decide on that particular year? Not too far in the future.
Yeah, that's a little bit of an in-joke, and I just needed a date, to be honest. And I couldn't set it too far out because I wanted the character to have lived in our time period, because the events that he's involved with are happening in the 2010s, 2012, I think. So the 2038 it's a kind of an inside joke for computer programmers. The way that time is measured it's sometimes called epoch time or Unix time. It's the number increments 1 per second, starting in January 1st, 1970, and we will run out of numbers by the year 2038. So that's why it takes place then, is it's sort of it's a marker of an end time. And that has nothing to do with the plot of the story. It's just mostly, it just was a nice round number for me to use. But in practical terms too, to be honest, I also wonder, honestly, if the internet as we have it today is going to last. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, will there be another internet, and how will we migrate from this one to the next one? Nothing in technology is, set in stone. Everything is always in transition. And so I don't know that something like that would happen in 2038, but at the growth that we're going and the way we depend on the internet for everyday activities, I have to wonder if at some point in the near future, we have to go through such a transition.
I'm hoping it's not quite as soon as 2038, just because the next internet kind of creeps me out. Maybe I'm just being old, and you kids need to get off my lawn. But no, I don't want. I don't want to be connected to the internet at all times.
That's referenced in the book. How some people, the older people in that world, don't want to get a hole drilled into their neck, and so they kind of live offline. I can understand that. I would be freaked out too to go into a room and have someone drill into my spine. So
yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Noroi, because he is definitely a complicated main character. Well, what can you say about him without giving too much away? And why do you think readers, might resonate with him as a character?
Well, first of all, the book is obviously, I don't think I think you just read the back cover and you could get an idea that this is definitely an homage to Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, the hard-boiled Private Eyes. I think what's different about him, though, is that he's not the typical PI. He puts on a facade early on in the book, but it becomes pretty obvious quickly that he's a vulnerable person, that he's involved in this story, that he's not the outsider coming in and observing what has happened and trying to maybe perhaps make amends. He has some skin in the game, so to speak, and that self-interest means that he has to make a pretty tough choice at the end, and he has to consider what's good for him versus what's good for people at large. And the vulnerability, I believe, comes through in a number of places where it's obvious that he was hurt in the past, and that's still something that haunts him. Memories play a big, it's in the title. Memory plays a big part in this book, and the way memories press down on the present.
Okay, so now that you have a better idea about this book, and Jim has explained it to you better than I can, we're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Jim will be talking about how he keeps details straight when he writes something like this, because there are all of those layers, and there is that jumping back and forth between different time periods and memories and reality, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Podcast. I am speaking today with author Jim Nelson about his new cyber-noir thriller, In My Memory Locked. Before the break, we were talking about, the part of that title includes memory and how all those memories kind of layer upon one another. So we're going to continue with that conversation going forward.
So when you're writing a story like this, where there's a lot of layers, it's a thriller, it's a mystery in some ways, but also you've got a lot of his past experiences that come to play in the present, especially with your memories kind of being stored. I don't exactly know how that all works, but on the Nexternet. So, your memories are your memories, but they're also not your memories. How do you, as an author, keep all of that straight in terms of, you've got the past, the present, the two of them sort of colliding in on each other? Do you have a specific way of writing that helps you keep all those details straight?
Yeah, I actually keep. I'm a big proponent of writing notebooks, of having a notebook to help you both collect all the inspiration and creative thoughts you may have, but also a way to organize those thoughts. And I've written about this on my blog, but I started using a digital notebook to help organize when I wrote this book, In My Memory Locked. Early on, I don't worry about that. Early on, I'm just sort of, as I was developing the novel, I was just like, well, this happened to us in the past, and this happened, and it shows up here in the book. But as I progressed in the writing of the novel, I began writing timelines. Just literally, okay, this at this year in his past, I didn't have to know the exact day in the past that something happened, but I'd say, okay, in 2011, this happened to him, and in 2012, he does this, in 2015, just to keep notes. So I'm maintaining time and dates and order of events, I probably created 3 or 4 of those timelines as the book developed to make sure I was keeping everything straight. It's really the only way you can do it. You need to have, and it needs to be written down. So even if it's on the computer, it can't be something you juggle in your head. And I think that I believe in that process because I think that's very real. I mean, if you just meet with a friend and you're talking and they're talking about their past, you're going to hear them bounce back and forth between memories of when they were a teenager and something happened when I was an adult and something happened last week. And to them, it all makes sense. The ordering is very natural because they lived it. So I have to kind of somehow organize that and make sure it makes sense, so that way it sounds like Norroy's lived it. That's what's important to me.
In terms of the story itself, what was your inspiration? What was your jumping off point for this book?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a software engineer. I've written software since I was a kid, and I'm always been fascinated with computers and the rise of the internet. So that definitely has some play here. But I think more specifically, though, it's the rise of social networks, which kind of caught a lot of people in the tech industry off guard. I don't think anyone predicted Facebook and Twitter back in the 90s or the 80s. It just that wasn't something that people were predicting. People were predicting like, well, you're going to have 500 TV channels, or you're going to be able to send email to your friends without having to write an actual letter. And the social networks, with the rise of that, became the rise of this what's called cancel culture. And some of the early instances of that really fascinated me. There was one case in particular about a man in Canada, I think, who was being taken to court, and the people complaining, they wanted him banned from the internet. And I had never heard that before. I was like, how can you be banned from the internet? I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it succeeded, by the way. But it was just kind of a funny concept. And of course, as a writer, you're sort of like, well, what if you could be banned from the internet? Well, and I don't want to give away too much, but yeah, Noroi has been through this, and so he's been, in a term we would use today, he had been canceled, in other words, and that's part of what's haunting him. And so I did those events sort of fed into this. What would it be like to be the receiving end of that, and having to live with that, and being banned from this piece of technology that is about as ubiquitous as oxygen? So, how could someone live like that? I just imagined into this person's life and what it would be like. And then finally, Roy's an older guy. I think he's 55 in the book. I'm 50. So that was a chance to write. Normally, when you write a novel, you tend to write about people in their 20s and 30s. I don't know why. We just tend to gravitate towards that age, or younger even. And I'd never written a story. Well, I guess I've written a short story, but I've never written a novel about a person who's sort of facing the end of their life, or I don't want to say the end of their life. They're facing old age and coming to the end, and having to have all these memories be a burden, and to live in a society, because that's the other thing about the internet, to live in a culture where we don't forget anything anymore. If you said something on Twitter 10 years ago, people can pull it up right away and say, hey, what did you mean by this? We're coming to a nexus point in our culture where there will be nothing forgotten. And what would it be like in the future for people where their entire lives have been recorded and anything can be brought up and used against them? So
Yeah.
all of that fed in.
Mhm. You mentioned earlier, just how quickly things are moving, and I sometimes think about that. If things have moved this far just in my lifetime, I can't quite imagine what it's going to be for the next generation by the time they're my age. Just how evolved things will have gotten. In terms of, oh no, go ahead. No,
well, I was just gonna make a point that, like I said, I grew up not far from Silicon Valley, and even in the 1970s, they were talking about this. I remember it. I remember them talking about like a worldwide network, and I think what's amazing is that there are people thinking about that today. Like, what's next? I'm not privy to it. I don't want to claim that I have any inside information, but there's back then it was more of a hobbyist thing. It was more like, wouldn't that be cool? But now you have these major corporations that have a real stake in it, and you've got governments getting involved now because they have a real stake in it. Yeah, I don't think it's going to slow down, and that for better or for worse. I think it's just going to get more and more intense.
Social media not being really predicted, and I never thought about it before, but yeah, a lot of things that we have now were kind of alluded to on Star Trek, or not alluded to, but you saw it in Star Trek. They never
Absolutely
had Facebook.
Right. Yeah, you never saw Spock get canceled by Scotty,
Right. Unfriended.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's just it but at the same time it was also, I don't want to sound too sage, but I remember it was actually not Facebook that I first saw. It was it Friendster or MySpace? It was one of the early social networks, and it was one of those things where I first saw the website and I did one of those V8 things where I slapped my forehead and said, "Of course, this is why didn't I think of this?" It made so much sense in hindsight. It seems so natural now, but it's interesting how at the time it really hadn't been predicted, hadn't been really foreseen, and I think some of that's led to some of the problems with social networks because we weren't prepared for it in any way. So
yeah. how much research then did you do for the book? I mean, I realize it's in the future, so part of it is speculative, but it is based in current technology.
Yeah, I didn't do that much research for this. I didn't do, some of the stuff you're mentioning. How do you store memories? And I think the technology is neural networks or neuromimetic gels that are used to store memories. That's what it is. I didn't really do a lot of study into like the functions of the brain or how memories are stored. I'm not a biologist by any means. The computer stuff, I don't claim that it's all 100% accurate. This is not a story that's making a hard prediction about the future. But some of the technology just comes natural to me. It's very familiar to me. So I feel like I can write about it with that background knowledge. Most of the research that I did do was actually digging up some of these old stories on like I mentioned, like cancel culture and what happened to those people actually. That's also interesting, is to find stories that, what happened to this person? What happened to the kid that was playing with the lightsaber on a video on YouTube and everyone mocked him for it? It turned out he had a number of emotional issues that he had trouble overcoming. Things like that. It was more the human side of being online and being very online. That's another thing that's fascinating me is this rise of people who are online just constantly. And what does that do? Because I'm not like that. I'm not that kind of person. I try to get away from the computer when I can.
And I mean, as you said, the title of the book is in my memory locked. So there's that theme of memory. There's also then this parallel theme of trying to forget or trying to block out some of that. And there's an interesting they're called blue lounges. So about that part of the culture.
I'm sorry, you broke up during the question. Could you repeat that?
Sure. So memory plays a huge role in this book. As you mentioned, it's in the title, in my memory locked. So there's also this sort of parallel track in the story about trying to forget or trying to disconnect from all of that. Can you talk a little bit about the blue lounges and the role they play?
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, there's in my book there's it's called a neuro liqueur. It's a drink that people take to forget. And the blue lounges are these special bars, almost like hookup bars or opium dens. People go into to get away from the world. They actually remove the device that's in their head to get off the network, and then they drink this drink, and it just wipes away your memory. Yeah, that was pretty fun. That part of the book. I guess I should have brought that up earlier. A lot of those blue lounges, as they're called, are actually based on bars in San Francisco. San Francisco has a number of really colorful cocktail bars. Some of them were the design and the interiors are obviously someone spent a great deal of time and money to produce them. Some of them are gone now. Some of them are out of business. Actually, with the COVID-19 thing, a lot of them are going out of business. But I sort of took ideas from them and I incorporated them into those blue lounges. So each one that the Noroi goes into is different. The idea it just seemed to me that when I sort of devised this blue neuro liqueur that wipes memories, it was just an idea that came to the development that there's going to be people who need to get away from this, and it won't be enough to just disconnect their brain from the network to live in this world where everything is remembered. You need some relief from that, and some people go to these lounges and consume this drink, and it has obvious parallels to alcoholism or drug abuse, but that was just something I wanted to explore. This idea that that there are people in this world that don't want to be so online, and that if the world progressed this direction as I'm writing, we're going to have to find some way to get away from it, even briefly, just for a couple hours.
Let's go ahead and take that second break of the podcast. When we come back, Jim will be talking about autobiographical elements or not in the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Jim Nelson. We are speaking about his new cyber-noir thriller. It is called In My Memory Locked. Let's go ahead and return now to the interview with Jim.
So you mentioned obviously your experience writing or being a software engineer. Are there that would have come into play for the book, but are there other autobiographical elements in the book or other parts of your life or world that came into play in the book in any way?
A little bit. This isn't something that I play up very often, but I'll mention it here. I do work. The company I work for, it's a nonprofit based in San Francisco called the Internet Archive, and that's exactly what the Internet Archive does. Is we store old websites and web pages and books and CDs and music and present them online. But we're most well known for what's called the Wayback Machine, which is a website that allows you to look at websites from the past. So I often tell people, if you want to see what the New York Times looked like on the morning of September 11th, 2001, you can see it. You can actually see like 6 or 8 different snapshots as the day progressed. So I have some connection there. I just make sure it's clear. The Internet Archive is not in this book. I'm not writing about the Internet Archive or anybody there, but working there has given me a chance to think about this idea of digital memory and how we sort of use it to supplant organic memory. This idea that if it's, there's this concept that it's not on the internet, it's not for real. You sometimes hear that. And by storing the history of the internet, we can even see things that were for real but are gone now, so to speak. So that played a part of it. Other biographical parts, I would say some of the experiences that Noroi went through. I won't go too deeply into it, but I was able to take some personal incidents in my past and put them into the book. But by and large, I'm not Noroi. That's not me. So it's very light touches that I applied.
Sure. I don't want to, it's always tricky to talk about the end of a book because you don't want to give stuff away.
Sure. Is there nudge, wink, wink code if you want?
Right. I'm just wondering if there's any possibility of returning to this world, or if this is, this is just a one-off.
That's a great question. Yeah. Without getting into the ending, yes, I do think there may be another book here. It certainly it was quite a ride to write this book. This may have been the most difficult book I've ever written, just because of all the layering and all that. But yeah, I've thought about that, and I don't want to go back to it quite yet. I need to take a breather. But yes, I think there may be another It probably won't be like a tightly woven sequel. It'll probably just be another book with related characters set in the same universe. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's turn now to the other new book that you have out this year, and that's called Stranger Sun. It's book 3 of the Bridge Daughter cycle. So let's start with the cycle in general. Can you give an overview of that story?
Sure. So I first wrote Bridge Daughter. I guess it was first published in 2016. That's the first book of the 3. Bridge Daughter is set in a world that's very much like our own, except it has this one biological difference, which is that women give birth to daughters only, and those daughters are called bridge daughters, who are born pregnant with the actual child, and so they're the surrogate essentially. So these bridge daughters are raised and when they turn 18, when they turn 13, they grow pregnant they grow visibly pregnant. They give birth and they die. And then the parents raise the real child, so to speak. And the story is, the first story is about a young girl who is raised as a normal child, and then she learns on her 13th birthday that she's actually a bridge daughter and that she will die soon. I don't want to go, too much further into that particular book, but that's the world that this is set in. The second book is called Hagar's Mother, and it's set in the same world, but it's also the same family. I'm sorry. So essentially, the books, as I've been writing them, have been subsequent generations of the same family and how they deal with this issue in this world. And just to make sure it's clear, this is not the result of like genetic mutation or like a government experiment. This is just the biology of this alternate universe. People have just come to accept it, that this is the natural course of life. So Hagar's Mother was dealing with the second generation, and then Stranger Sun is the third generation, and it's set in about modern time. Bridge Daughter was set in 1983, if I recall. So it's set today. It's like 2020 or 2019, I suppose. Yeah, that's sort of the overview of the series. Each book deals with different aspects of these bridge daughters. Hagar's Mother is about a mother of twin bridge daughters. And then the third book, Stranger Sun, is about a bridge daughter who has undergone a procedure that allows her to live. She can survive, but the child within her is essentially killed or made comatose, technically. She doesn't give birth. And so she's sort of living on the run, living on the street, because the procedure is completely illegal. And the third book, the other two books I sort of created, set them in a world that's very similar to ours, almost identical, save for the biological aspect. The third book, I had a little bit of fun with it. I decided to it's set in modern times, but it's set in a California that has split in two, that the northern part of the state has turned into what's called Jefferson, which is an actual movement in Northern California to split off and form a separate state. I imagine you're familiar with this.
Living in Northern California, as you do.
Yeah. It's just that some people, even who live here, have never heard of it. So I wasn't sure if you had heard of it or not. And so for that, I did a little bit of research. It's actually something that's been going on since the 1940s. I had no idea. So the idea is that in the southern part of the state, the coastal part of the state, they're called Hagars. These are the bridge daughters that have gone through this procedure and lived into adulthood. They've decriminalized it, but the Jefferson side of things is still pretty hardline against them. And the Hagar in the book wants to reunite with her sister's son, who has been missing since she was a child, and she has to go into Jefferson in order to meet with him, and it's all about that. So that's the one book where it's really not as close to our world as perhaps the others, but it was a lot of fun to write. It was a lot of fun to do, to write about that, and how I love writing about California. I just think it's a really interesting place with a really interesting history, and so yeah.
This is the third book. Will there be others in this series?
I'm planning on it. I'm planning on a fourth book and maybe even a fifth.
Okay.
I'm sort of. It's not over. That's for certain.
And again, without giving too much away, I mean, you can talk about how it's evolved so far, but how do you foresee it evolving as the series goes on?
I don't want to give away too much, but it's called the Bridge-Daughter Cycle for a reason. And I foresee, I'll just give a little teaser here. I actually see the fourth book going back in time and going back into the family's history, an earlier step in the family history. So the idea is that there might be some looping in the book. Also,
right.
I haven't plotted it out, so I couldn't tell you exact. I haven't written it yet, so I couldn't tell you exactly what happens. But yeah, that's sort of the idea right now. Is what maybe get a better idea of what led to the events in these first three books.
I do love a good prequel, especially when it kind of, fills in more of that picture. And a prequel will mean a different time period, which is fun. I just like historical time periods. You know that. At any rate, time for our last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be speaking more about the Bridge-Daughter series and Stranger Son in particular. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I have been speaking with Jim Nelson. We had been speaking about his new cyber-noir thriller. We have now moved on to the third book in his Bridge-Daughter series. That book is called Stranger Son, and let's go ahead and get back to that interview with Jim.
And I think you mentioned when we spoke the first time you were on the podcast, we did talk about that first book, the Bridge-Daughter, and you mentioned that you had based that on the biological aspect of giving birth to a daughter that then gives birth to the actual child. That some insects do that? Is that where you got the idea? Is that correct?
That's not where I got the idea, but it was sort of like when I actually, the idea came up on my own, but I had to verify. I was like, am I crazy? Could this actually, this sounds bonkers. And I looked it up. It's like, oh, there's insects that reproduce this way. Matter of fact, some of the medical terminology in the books comes from that style of reproduction. I don't think there's any mammals that do this. I'm sure there's not. That would be, yeah. But no, the idea came from, the original idea for the story actually I was waking up one morning and it kind of hit me, and while I was sort of in between sleep and awake. I don't really know where it came from, but I'm glad I stuck with it. It's been a very, I really enjoy writing those books. It's hard to explain. There's elements of my family that are in those books. In Stranger Son, there's elements of my own immediate family in that book. But it allows me to write some of these personal details at a distance. I'm not as involved. And so it allows me to be more objective about things that if I had written about them from an autobiographical point of view, I would have had more at stake, and I think I wouldn't have been as objective about it. And I really do enjoy writing those books. That's why I plan on writing more. They come very naturally.
Mhm. And so, what are you working on now, or are you taking a break since you've had 2 books come out recently?
Actually, believe it or not, I think I'm going to have a 3rd book ready before Thanksgiving. And I know that at this point, I start sounding like a pulp writer who's just cranking them out. But it's not technically true. I wrote Stranger Sun at the end of last year and got it published this year. And then In My Memory Locked, I worked on the year before that, but I had to take a break. It just was complicated enough where I needed to get away from it a little bit. The book I'm working on now is actually it takes place, it's not science fiction. It takes place this year, in fact. It takes place during the first weeks of the lockdown in California. It's about a security guard who is, the orders have come in, quarantine, coronavirus, and he has insomnia. And he wakes up one night and he sees people working outside under the street, and it doesn't look right. There's something not quite right. What's going on? And he goes out to investigate. I won't go too much farther into it, but it's definitely a paranoia conspiracy type book. I was definitely thinking of like the old 1970s government conspiracy theory movies, like the 3 Days of the Condor. It's sort of set with that kind of thinking in mind, that something's wrong here. What's going on? And that came very quickly. That book came very quickly, just because I was able to take, again, some just personal experiences. Everyone's gone through this. I think this is, whatever you say about COVID-19 or the coronavirus, this has been a shared ride. Everybody in the world is affected by this in some way. And it was just, in some ways, I just wanted to take some of the things that I've experienced, that I know other people have experienced, and write them out in a way that I don't know, maybe gets a chance to examine them without having to be too deeply involved, So this is something that's happening to one person's life, but he begins to think it might be affecting everybody.
Mhm. Yeah, and I can only imagine that there are going to be a lot of books coming out in the near future that are either set during the lockdown or inspired by events of the lockdown. I almost don't know if I'm eager or not eager to read some of those. It's like too soon. And also, it's like stepping back and taking a different look at it. I just read a book that was set in 1918 during the Spanish flu, and I was like, this is not the right time to be reading this book.
Yeah, boy, that's the real book for uplifting, to get away from things, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, I should, as someone, I publish my books independently through Kindle Press, and it's one thing I've noticed. You go on, there's websites, people who don't know, there's websites that are dedicated to producing, they pre-produce covers, and then it's sort of like a catalog. You go through and you find what covers that sort of match your book, and then you say, okay, I'd like to buy that one, and then that's your cover for your book. It's sort of a cheap way of doing it without getting an illustrator to do one specifically for your spec. Well, anyway, that's what I've noticed over the last 6 months, is all of a sudden there's all these covers of like viruses floating through microscopes, and it's a big deal. I did hesitate to write this book. That was the thing I thought is people really going to want to read this right now, and is the market going to be flooded with these books? But I think I've written a more, I don't want to be too, I'm not trying to over differentiate myself, but I think it's a very personal book, and it's not like a thriller where someone's being chased through the streets at gunpoint or something like that. It's more about someone who, I hate to say it, but an average person, someone with just one of us, sort of dealing with these problems. And if people don't read it now, maybe they'll read it 5 years from now, or even 20 years from now, going, what was that all about? The way the way, if a year ago you had read that book on the Spanish flu, it probably would have seemed like a foreign world. It would have just seemed, wow, how could they have lived through that? And at some point in our future, that's what younger people are going to be saying. What was that like? How did they manage? And I wanted to incorporate some of just the day-to-day details, having to wash your hands constantly throughout the day and having to wear a mask and not being allowed to leave the house. I wanted that to be the story, not stories of scientists racing to develop a cure against the clock and things like that. That's somebody else's book. That's not what I write.
Yeah. Are there any of your other writings that you would want to talk about at this point?
I mean, I think what you've heard is sort of all my latest stuff. I will say just briefly that I've recently started a Substack. It's an online mailing list where I'm focusing more on the business side of independent publishing, writing, producing, publishing, Kindle covers, and all that. That I just started within the last week, and hopefully, if there's anybody listening who is interested in getting into independent publishing or is doing it and is looking for inspiration or information, that they might come on over and check me out. I've been doing it for 6 years now. I'm not the biggest pro, but when you've been doing it for 6 years, you kind of I realized that I had some things to say and some insight. So that's why I started it.
Okay, and where can people find that? Is it on your website? Does it have a different website?
It's a different website. It's linked to on my website, but I'll just give the URL. It's Jim Nelson. That's one word, JIMNELSON .substack.com.
All right, thank you. And on the other side of the coin, instead of what have you been writing, what have you been reading lately?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like you. I've been sort of looking for a little bit of escapist material. So I recently started on my regular blog, my author blog, a series on great Hollywood novels about Hollywood. And I recently read Bud Schulberg's What Makes Sammy Run, which is about it's written by a Hollywood insider. Bud Schulberg actually grew up. His father was a producer in like 1930s, 1940s Hollywood, and he has this really wonderful perspective of what Hollywood was like back then. And it's about very much about the how cutthroat Hollywood can be. But even though it sounds pretty bleak, it's actually it's a funny book. It was surprisingly humorous. So I just finished that, and then I just recently picked up Leonard Gardner's Fat City, which is a story about boxing. It's set in Sacramento, and I've been really enjoying that. It's wonderfully written.
Fun. Thank you for that. We actually just talked about the Substack website, but if you could give your author website as well as where people might be able to connect with you on social media.
Sure. Yeah, my author's website is j-nelson.net. And from there you can find links to the Substack I mentioned, as well as my Facebook and Twitter page. At Twitter, I'm @_Jim Nelson_. And my Facebook page is facebook.com/ I think it's, I'm blanking, I think it's j-nelson.net. But yeah, if you go to j.nelson.net, you can definitely find links to everywhere I am on the web, including my Amazon authors page. And I also have a mailing list if you want to be notified about future books. I don't really, I always tell people get on my mailing list. I only send out maybe 2 or 3 a year at most. I basically just notify people when new books come out.
All right. Thank you for that. Is there anything that we haven't covered? We've talked about a lot of different topics, but is there anything that we have not covered that you wanted to mention about the books or writing or anything at all?
No, I'm really glad to get a chance to reconnect with you again. I enjoyed our last conversation, I think, and I'm enjoying this one too. So thank you.
Well, thank you for not saying I enjoyed our last conversation, but this one kind of sucked.
I wouldn't
You're
say
very
that to
nice.
your
You
face.
would say
Okay?
that.
I wouldn't
No,
say that to
exactly. Exactly. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for...
I seriously have been looking forward to this. I really have been looking forward to this all week. So
Yeah,
it's really nice
wonderful.
to have a chance to talk with you.
Yeah, it's good to catch up in an author kind of way, a book kind of way.
Right.
So I do want to thank you for taking time out of your weekend to talk to me about your two new books, In My Memory Locked and Stranger's Son. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking.
And thank you once again to Jim for joining me for a second interview on the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I love when I have authors return. It's like talking to an old friend in some ways, and Jim is always interesting to talk to. I enjoy speaking with him. So thank you, Jim, for joining me. Thank you, as always, to you, listeners. You know I love you. You know that I am so appreciative of you and your role in this podcast. You love books. I know you do, and that just makes us friends for life. And so, friends, let's talk about the next episode when I will be interviewing author Steve Goebel about his new book in the Spider-John mystery series. It's the third in that series, and I have 3 words for you. Pirate, murder, mystery. Yes, pirate, murder, mystery. I didn't know I needed that genre in my life, but it's way fun. I don't even know where to start. It's 1723. There are pirates. There is smuggling. There's lots of stuff going on. There's murder, of course, because it's a murder mystery. So you're going to have to tune in to find out more about this book. Oh, it's called A Bottle of Rum. I should tell you that, not just the name of the series. A Bottle of Rum. It's a Spider-John mystery. It's by Steve Goebel. Pirate, murder, mystery. Join me for the next episode. Again, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I hope you're having a wonderful, fantastic, great week. We're almost through October, which is crazy. I hope that your October has been treating you well. Whatever you've been up to, if you've been doing fun fall-like activities, if you have been binging on Halloween candy that you're supposed to be maybe giving out to trick-or-treaters, if your community is trick-or-treating this year, whatever it is, I hope that it is treating you well and that you are taking plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.